He has resigned for the troubled world to see. He showed the principles of free democracy. The greatest man in Europe history is the truth. He was a hero in the wars for us a youth. Eisenhower praised him for his great advice. His wisdom and courage that was always nice. He was the greatest prime minister, a genius and a pal of America. Ministers may reign, but we'll never find a brain like Winston Churchill again. Hitler and Mussolini really done a lot. Churchill planned how to get them in the pot. He made an offer as the primer when he sat. Blood, toil, tears, sweat, how you look at that. He was provoked, so he did defend. And Hitler and his gang had a bitter end. He was the bravest prime minister, a genius and a pal of America. Ministers may reign, but we'll never find a brain like Winston Churchill again. His father was a lord, he was the eldest son. That's why many great things he have done. Was educated at Sanharu, a journalist. King, the world will tell you so. One man means so much to everyone. We missed his leadership, now he's gone. He was the greatest prime minister, a genius and a pal of America. So ministers may reign, but we'll never find a brain like Winston Churchill again.
The views of that bumper song do not necessarily reflect those of the reviewer. Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to review the third volume of Sir Winston Churchill's Second World War series, The Grand Alliance. We have now made it halfway through this study. As you know, I am putting on hiatus my Holocaust study. I've committed to reading every single book on that event so named. But each and every time I went to the library, I saw Sir Winston glaring at me. I need a good glaring picture here. Of course, it'll be the very last picture, the one, whatever it is that here we go. Winston was glaring at me from the shelves, and I had to oblige him. And I do think when I return to the former study and reading, and I should think writing response, that my reading and our reading, because of course you are reading this series along with me, aren't you? Easily available at your library. I'm sure this will serve us in good stead for the larger theater of war and the larger drama of the Second World War beyond the Shoah, the Endensloh, the Holocaust, whatever you want to call it. So background is what this text is. Now, indeed, I am not particularly taken with Churchill as a world leader, much less as a military leader. I have said before in this series of reviews, I will say it again, it's a grand shame that Churchill didn't stay a grand author of books like The Grand Alliance. The world would have been a happier place, I think, if he stayed out of politics and military matters. But in any case, he is in the driver's seat, and this third volume of this valuable set of memoirs concerns, as I say, this pivotal time. Now, as it happens, volume 4, The Hinge of Fate, concerns, given the other volumes, basically 1 year. The Hinge of Fate, let's say from the spring, actually not even a year, I would say from the spring of 41 42, the spring of 42, probably to the fall of that year. And then the closing ring picks up there. So the Hinge of Fate actually, I think, encompasses topically, not titularly, but topically, a lot of what's happening in the Grand Alliance. So this is the last stretch where Britain is alone in the war. Now, Churchill was very careful, especially in The Gathering Storm, to portray himself as a voice in the wilderness and so forth. The impact of this series on English historiography, English language historiography, I should say, is massive. I think we can thank Winston, in fact, for the very title, the Second World War. There were various terms that were bandied about at that time. The Hitler War, the Great Patriotic War for the Soviets. The Germans called it the War Against Jewish Rat Bankers, if memory serves. That was the official term, or maybe not the official term, but that was the term for radio broadcasts and so forth. The War Against Jewish Rat Bankers. Somewhat partial to that, in fact. The Americans called it the Great Democratic War, or the War for Democracy, from the likes of a figure who becomes more and more prominent, and that, of course, is FDR, buried not very far from where I'm recording this, just right across the Hudson River. But it's Churchill and his Second World War, of course, which becomes the moniker which sticks in various languages. So there we go. Now, before we get too long in the tooth here, if your whistle is really wetted for history, I encourage you to take a look at ApocatastasIs. We accept students of about 15 years of age on up. And as concerns history and our courses of that subject, and literature for that matter, you may check out our School of Arts. So go to academics and go down to our School of Arts, and you can check out the appropriate courses. With that being seen, Chu, I have here on my little telephone the table of contents from the book, so they will keep us on track here. Of course, this is not a blow-by-blow, but as we have seen in the previous texts, each one of these, as it's published here, are broken up into 2 books. And I suspect that's part of the original publishing schema. That's an older usage to break a single volume up into books, even originally, as opposed to, where you might have a book published in several volumes that are combined. I do not believe this 6-volume series, as we see it, was ever anything other than a 6-volume series. I don't believe the volumes were merged. I think it's just a way Churchill used to pivot the 2 testaments, I suppose, because we see that again and again: the Gathering Storm, the Finest Hour, the Grand Alliance. So there we go. And I should say these were published very interestingly by Time Life. And very likely at the end of this review, there will be a 7th review where I will talk about the historiographical aspects of the whole series, including the interjection of editors from Time Life into the text, shaping the narrative, and thus, because of the significance of this collection, the subsequent perception of the war, the whole idea of German aggression, England holding out, and America coming to England's aid for democracy, and all of this, right? This is all shaped by the likes of Churchill. And that's fine, as long as we recognize that people who were not Churchill had their fingers in the pie. So I'll tease you with that. And these telephones, I'm not good with them. I just had it. Here we go. All right. So book 2 is Germany Drives East, and then book... So book 1 is Germany Drives East, and then book 2, War Comes to America. So having left off at the finest hour, we had England initially under attack. That's what Churchill described in the previous volume. That eventually ebbs, and Churchill indicates that the Germans are planning something elsewhere, hence the slacking of the Luftwaffe attacks. Also, and he was very clear, and the Germans knew this, there was no real way to invade England. We know subsequently that there was no serious invasion of England planned. It was certainly impossible. And a lot of the German high command were certainly of a very negative appraisal of what we call Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England. Many in the German high command were against this. Obviously, it never went off, and it could never go off because of the lack of German landing crafts, and also the defense that England would have made on its homeland. This was not vice versa like Normandy. When Germans and the Allies were fighting in France, that was neither of their home turf, except for the small contingent of Free French. But the main belligerents in France were not French. It's different, as the Allies found out when they entered Germany. It's different when you're fighting a foe on their turf. So flip the script. Had Germany somehow been able to cross the English Channel, like William the Conqueror or something, and even get a beachhead in England, the resistance they would have faced, certainly after the initial collapse of France, there was this chaotic period where it almost seemed, in the chaos of the time, you can only imagine the fear, but in those initial weeks after the capitulation of France in the spring of 1940, it almost seemed the Germans would just steamroll into England until people realized, well, how the hell are they going to do that without the necessary and voluminous amount of landing crafts that didn't exist. So anyway, this volume indeed deals with the slacking of the Battle of Britain and the ramping up of the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat war. I don't know what E-boats are. Churchill has used in the previous volumes specialized terminology for things we still have or have knowledge of, but we don't call them that. So for instance, he speaks about ASDICs, which seems like an acronym, ASDICs. And I wouldn't even pretend to spell that, but that's what we call radar now. Radar is what he calls ASDICs. You kind of have to figure out what he's talking about. Or he consistently has talked about what are called aerodromes. And these are what we call airports. And in fact, in the previous two volumes, he referred to aerodromes, and reading behind the scenes, the closing ring right now, he has switched to the language of airports. And these were published 1946 through the 1950s. I suppose by the time we get to the closing ring, it's the early 1950s. So maybe the term airport had begun to dominate by that point. Anyway, there's some specialized and period lingo here, which is charming in its own right. For a man as literate as Churchill, there are not very many literary references, but you can tell that when he drops them, he certainly knows what he's going on about. And perhaps it's a sign of humility or a good popular pen to not overdo it with the references to classical history or whatnot. But there's a couple poems here and there that are mentioned, a couple of ancient similes and whatnot. And of course, that would be very much of someone of Churchill's background and the focus that a man of his age would have had growing up on the classics. Now, a great deal of time beyond the U-boat war is taken up with the North African campaign. This is really the first time that England can go after the Axis. And remember, when this book picks up, that access still includes, at least by way of treaty, the Soviet Union with the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. So things are very much, the momentum is very much in the Germans' favor. The Italians are recognized to be second tier compared to the Germans, but still worthy foes. And Confederation of the Germans and the Italians, of course, held North Africa under Rommel, whom we can see here in the lower left of the screen. The Desert Fox. Now, the threat, when the book picks up, which let's say is going into 1941, just spring of 41 all the way through, really I will say the following spring and thereabouts, 42, late winter. The situation in North Africa is that the Axis is driving towards Egypt, because if they can do that, they can cut the Suez Canal. Really appreciative of the background that Churchill gave in this volume, as well as the previous one, to the colonial situation. I don't think about it. I don't think you think about it that much either. We focus on the big battles, the Stalingrads and the D-Days. We focus on the big personalities and generals and things. We don't often think much about the whole colonial situation. And Churchill, as Prime Minister and First Lord of, Minister of Defense at this point, he's not Lord of the Admiralty anymore, although he refers to himself habitually when he speaks to Roosevelt as former naval person. I believe Roosevelt was Secretary of Navy earlier in his life, as was his cousin Teddy. But I don't know why Churchill would refer to himself as former naval person unless there was some connection with Roosevelt. And I do believe there was. You can prove me wrong on your own research there. Hell of a picture, this one. But in any case, the British are going to hold Egypt altogether and go on the offensive. There's a whole backstory about Algeria and the Free French and de Gaulle and so forth. But this is really where the Allies, with what little momentum they have, remember, America's not in the war from 1940, 1941 until literally the very last days of December. So England wants to go on the offensive. It's had some success navally. It's cutting its teeth with the convoy system, which more and more has success. Churchill is something of a plyometrician. That is to say, he is very much into crunching numbers, and he puts a great deal of faith into industrial output, winning the war ultimately. He has, in this third volume, made occasional reference to the American Civil War, which was very much a war of attrition, a war of sheer numbers and grinding down the enemy's resources as regards the North to the South. And he sees that being the case in the long run with the Allies' struggle with the Axis. That the Axis will not industrially be able to compete with the Allies, and therefore what the Allies need to do in the short term is keep their stuff together, keep their heads about them, keep in the fight, and let the factories do their work, because eventually the factories will outproduce those of the enemy, and they will eventually grind down. So that is Churchill's great faith, F-A-I-T-H, faith. And there is something fatalistic, F-A-T-E, fatalistic in Churchill's gamble here. And he keeps that from the very beginning. He always knows that if the industrial situation can ramp up, especially if America can get into the war, then it's a deal done, so to speak, against the Axis. Now, eventually, the Germans will attack in June of 41. Will attack Russia. Those of you who are inclined to laud the military prowess of Adolf Hitler in particular will remember this unbelievably foolish blunder, and a blunder made worse after Churchill treats the invasion of Cyprus, something we often look over and overlook. It's an invasion that's not only foolish in its grandiosity, but also in the fact that it started late. Hitler having gotten involved in the Balkans and the Ukraine to secure the oil fields and prop up certain allies in that neck of the woods, had to shear off some invading forces and shear off some time. And that means the winter is going to confront the Germans in Russia earlier than they would like, because they're, it's just a matter of perspective. They're later in the year, that's to say. And that invasion initially was very well, I think, and I think this is Churchill's summary as well. He doesn't really spend too much time on it, but I think the conduct and the difficulties that the Soviets had in Finland, I think they're in the late 30s, the Winter War, as it's called, and the walloping that the Finns gave to the Soviets, who I think were all, I don't know, you can also look that up. I'm not an expert here, I'm a reviewer, but in any case, the Soviets had a hard time of it in Finland. Whether they won or not, you can find out. But it was the example of Finland and the piss poor job the Soviets did there that I think, and Churchill makes a few allusions to this, is what gave Hitler some indication that he would be successful in toppling the Soviet regime and capturing huge, enormous swaths of land. If you look at the invasion plans, it's basically, if it helps, everything. If you look at a map of America, everything from the East Coast to the Mississippi. If you can imagine a piece of land that big, that's what Hitler tried to incorporate, that size of land, into the Soviet Union. And initially that was very successful for reasons of surprise. Also, and this I think was borne out in Finland as well, also Stalin spent much of the 1930s gutting his officer corps, an officer corps which, whatever its loyalty, according to Stalin, certainly was competent and was veteran, having come through the First World War and the Civil War and so forth. A lot of those leaders were gone thanks to the purges, and that did not stand the Soviet army in any good stead whatsoever during the German invasion. Getting back to the text here, the Grand Alliance, Volume 3, what that means as concerns the British Union is that the United Kingdom, that's the term I wanted, the United Kingdom, is that the aid which Roosevelt and his people were sending to Britain now was split, and Britain, as obviously with the breaking of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviets come in on the side of the Allies now, very abruptly. All of a sudden now, Britain is scrumming around trying to find military material to keep the Russians in the fight. This is obviously the biggest fight of the war, from the word go to the very end, is the Eastern Front. And for the moment, they really have to prop up the Soviets. The Soviets, well, much like Churchill had hoped for the United Kingdom and America, if it entered, has a huge industrial potential, but it takes a long time. And the Soviets are facing an existential threat in the way that Britain never was, because of that helpful English Channel and the frank focus of the German high command on infantry over naval focus. Hitler and his people were very much like Napoleon. They had a masterly grasp of ground warfare, of air warfare, of the new aspect concerning tanks and mobile fighting, but they did not have a great deal of interest and attention to naval matters beyond their advantage initially with the U-boats. Hence, getting back to earlier comments, the difficulty of crossing the English Channel without appropriate vehicles and appropriate numbers. Okay, so the Soviets are facing an existential threat, and so Britain and, in a roundabout way, Churchill have to, scrape up what they can and keep Stalin in the fight as long as possible. There's a great deal of attention paid to the Middle East. Again, Britain has a lot of interest there after the First World War. And then also, though it's not technically in the Middle East, but also Persia. There's a couple chapters given over to Persia, and including a note as to why in official publications and internal publications, the United Kingdom referred to it as Persia and not Iran. And that's because it's right next to another country called Iraq. And those two countries share 3 letters in their 4-letter names. And the chances of flubbing the identification of one country with another, especially because Britain was involved in certain coups in Iraq, and Germans were involved in counter coups and so forth. Both of those are on the burner, Iran and Iraq. So it was thought to keep the old moniker Persia, just for the sake of organization. In any case, a lot of interest in Persia, and whether it's Iraq or Persia. What happened in the Second World War very much presses on things in our own day. So I'll just leave it there on that account. Also, attention is given, of course, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, to events in the Pacific. Much like the Eastern Front, this is only a cursory treatment. Churchill is able to stay on topic and focus on the purpose of his Second World War series, which is his memoirs of his participation in the war, which means Britain's participation. In long and short, that means things like the Eastern Front, things like the Pacific Theater are only going to have a secondary, although in-depth, focus. And Churchill is very clear that beyond reading a few books, he's not in any sense an expert on Japan. He lays out briefly and helpfully, though, the conditions that led to the rise of Japan and the belligerency of Japan in the Orient. As he mentions in the second volume, in a communique, and of course these volumes are very valuable because of their primary documentation, very, very heavy amount of letters and telegraphs and so forth. And as he says in an earlier volume, that Britain, and this actually surprised me quite a bit, Britain would sacrifice the Suez Canal and it would sacrifice the Middle East in order to keep Australia and New Zealand. If it came down to it, and they were truly at an invincible situation with resources, and they could only support Anzacs and Australia and New Zealand, or their concerns in the Middle East, they would choose the former. And insofar as the United Kingdom has a toehold in that area in the Pacific, events in the Japanese front are addressed. Now, when these United States enter on the side of the Allies, something Roosevelt was really tiptoeing through the tulips with, I don't think it's that wild and crazy to say the United States knew that the attack was coming. I don't know how you have, as Churchill himself notes when he visits America at the end of the third volume, the intelligence and security apparatus in America, even in the 1940s, was excessive, in his observation as a world leader. And with that being said, I don't know how you have a giant Japanese carrier group massing and heading straight for Pearl Harbor for weeks, and the United States intelligence not picking that up. They who were able to pick up, along with other intelligence agencies, all sorts of minutia. But anyway, we can say at that discussion, how much did the Roosevelt people know about Pearl Harbor? Obviously, they wanted an excuse to get into the war. And you can see that, as I say, because Roosevelt is finding every possible legal hole at a time when people actually cared about precedent and decorum and Congress. All this is out the window now, but at a certain time, these were real things these were real road bumps that Roosevelt had to contend with, and he was doing everything possible to get around them. So something like Pearl Harbor would be manna from heaven in that agenda to get in on the war. And so anyway, indeed, we can save the nitty-gritty of the speculation for another day. The point is, In this volume, we see the situation, the war change dramatically, right? The Soviet Union now enters in on the side of the Allies, which Churchill is very quick to point out. The Allies, plural, were really at a certain point only England. And people join England. The Free French join England. The Soviets join England. The United States joins England. But Churchill takes pride, and the English take pride in being the very last holdouts at the darkest time when it seemed that Hitlerism, as it's referred to, was going to dominate the white man's world. That the British stood out. And of course, that plugs into themes of history and the Whig history, the idea of British liberty and so forth, English language, liberty and the Anglosphere, that goes back quite a ways. In any case, so a lot of stuff is changing, and part of that has a legal aspect. And so even before Pearl Harbor, there's a treatment of the Atlantic Charter, where Roosevelt and Churchill meet out near Iceland, Greenland, out in the ocean. Of course, you have to keep the U-boats in mind, very dangerous. And they come up with these dancing through the tulip arrangements about how America can help England out with the convoys and Lend-Lease and all this jazz. And then, of course, that legal concern becomes much greater after Pearl Harbor and the entry of these United States into the conflict. Of course, the subsequent declaration of war by Germany and I believe Italy shortly thereafter. That prompts Churchill to fly to America during the Christmas time. Again, this is only a fortnight after Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt is not going to be able to travel. Interestingly, just by the by, I always grew up hearing that nobody knew that Churchill was in a wheelchair. And the press corps was very polite, and they didn't want to humiliate him, and given the stigma of being in a wheelchair and being a so-called cripple and being a man of power politically, that these two things clashed, and people kept it under wraps. But Churchill is very clear that Roosevelt's in a wheelchair. He talks about rolling Churchill around. So I don't know if that became more widespread after the war. Roosevelt's incapacitation because of polio. I don't know. But because, again, these books are written in the late 1940s, 1950s. So that's some years after the war. So that would be an interesting thing to follow up on. That's number 3 for this review. I did my homework. You're going to have to do yours and find these questions that I raised. In any case, on the legal aspect, Churchill has to visit Roosevelt, and there's also a moral aspect. He wants to speak to the American Congress and American people, right? These are allies. They're going to need things out of America. America's going to need things from it. So we have to make a nice impression early on. Churchill also uses the occasion of his visit in 41, 42, in the Christmas season, to go up to Canada and address their parliament. Of course, Canada is part of the British Empire and the Commonwealth system. And then he goes down into, I believe he visits Florida, but I think that was an occasion to go visit British interests in Bermuda, or anyway, in the Caribbean. Of course, the British have a presence there. In fact, is it Bermuda, where Churchill brags, or rather they brag, that they have the longest sitting parliament in the Western Hemisphere. So there you go. But anyway, the third volume of this, The Grand Alliance, well titled, deals finally with Churchill's visit, or rather return to England, in what he calls a flying boat, a very big plane. So a lot of attention is given to his initial visit to America at this time on ship, given the U-boats and the convoys and all this stuff that he had to contend with, to say nothing of the Luftwaffe off the coast of Europe. But on the return visit, by happenstance, he takes this flying boat, this giant plane, a 2-story plane, would you believe it? They say we're progressing. Do we have 2-story planes, 2-story passenger planes with coach beds? I don't think so. So you can chew over that, whether we're actually progressing in life or not. Churchill in the 1940s was able to take a two-story airplane, passenger airplane, back to England. He was very much taken by his contraption and by the pilot and the skill of the pilot. Um, Although at the very end of the book, and this is the final memoir, as he brings the plane down, literally, the flying boat that Churchill took back to England in now the very beginning of 1942, very nearly strayed into German airspace and ended up approaching England from the easterly direction that the Luftwaffe was in the habit of doing. I guess they got lost in the fog a little bit. And very nearly they were shot out of the sky by the British RAF. But it did not come to pass, and the war went on in any case. So there we go, the third volume of Sir Winston Churchill's Second World War series, again, predominantly concerned with the North African theater, including the Mediterranean naval concern, and also the invasion of Cyprus by the Germans. Then the Middle Eastern theater, Persia. Of course, England has endless interest there at this time, as did the Germans. By the way, once they were through conquering Egypt, their plans were to move up, hence all this stuff with the Mufti of Jerusalem and all the Muslims and all this jazz. Also, I should just say, as I'm wrapping up here, the concern of Turkey. You're wondering, like, why is Turkey on the side of England? Weren't they on the side of Germany in the First World War? You have to remember, actually, no, the Ottomans were on the side of Germany in the First World War. The Turks, the Freemason Turks, they were flipped. They got in there because of the British and Lawrence of Arabia and all that jazz. So if you wonder, like, what happened? Well, that's what happened. The British have a lot of fingers in that part of the world. In any case, just recapping here, then we have the invasion of Germany, invasion by Germany of the Soviet Union, the Atlantic Charter, the Pearl Harbor, and the whole legal framework of the new Allied Command, the Unified Allied Command, ending with kind of a personal note of Churchill's time here in America during Christmas and his flight back, somewhat harrowing, somewhat luxurious, airplane bed, his flight back to England. So that's where Churchill puts down the plane, to use that simile, very appropriate, and that's where we put down this plane of a review. So you can easily access these volumes at your local library. No doubt they are sitting on the shelves waiting for you. You can also get them, I should think, rather inexpensively. These are popular books in the sense they were made for a mass market by Time Life here in America. So you ought to be able to find some cheap versions and reprints even of these. And then finally, worst case scenario, you can go to Yandex and download them for free, or archive for as long as that's going to be around for. And then when you have mastered this volume, you can check out our website. Has all you need for a huge intellectual life of the humanities: newsletters, open events, rants, raves, languages, and classes, including classes on history in our School of Arts. Check it out. And with that being said, thank you for joining me for this review, and get reading. Valete.